The envelope slid under her apartment door at 2:17 a.m. A single square of paper and a typed line. Fold the paper twice and do not look up. A cold taste of metal filled her mouth as the hallway light hummed overhead. Before we go any further, I'll ask you for a favor. Like the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment below this video with what time you listened to this story. She held the paper between numb fingers and felt its edges squeak, thin, almost moist, while the bulb above buzzed and cast a tired yellow pool on the carpet. The typed instruction sat precise and small, as if it were a command rather than a suggestion. She traced the small black letters as if reading a medical chart, the serifed type clicking in her mouth like teeth. Outside, the city breathed inside. The apartment smelled faintly of old coffee and the clean, hollow scent of disinfectant. She had not expected anything tonight. She had come home late from a shift that scraped at the edges of her patience and had fallen into an early sleep, only to be awakened by the scrape of paper sliding across wood and chain. She sat on the edge of the bed, legs cramped, breath misting slightly in the cool air. And for a moment, its absurdity, an instruction left for one anonymous resident, felt like a joke, like a prank thin enough to tear. But the metal taste lingered, and her mouth had that odd, dry gloss you get before you throw up or before you tell a lie. She turned the paper over. The back was blank, but for a faint watermark of concentric rings, as if the paper itself had been folded before, as if it remembered the crease. She pressed the tip of a thumbnail to the first corner and felt the give, the minute's soft resistance of fiber yielding, and the room inhaled. When she folded it the first time, the paper made a dry, small sound against her nail, a tiny crack like stepping on frost. The apartment registered the movement, a shift in light, the faint note of electrical hum dropping a few hertz, and then the window side condensation ran in brittle paths, small tributaries tracing themselves around the outline of her face in the glass. Her reflection hesitated, a hair out of step, an immediate fraction slower, so that when she blinked, the image still held its eyes open another blink after hers. She almost laughed then, the ridiculousness of it, the absurd domestic theater of a midnight note and a paper fold. Her fingers found the second crease, the one that left the paper with the neat, quartered shape of a fortune or a child's game. She held it folded in her palm, the instruction hidden like a tongue of paper in her fist, and the apartment waited as though it had been leaning forward to listen. At that moment, the light dipped, not a blackout, not even a flicker so much as a subtle lowering, as if someone had turned the room down a degree. Her breath sharpened the air in the apartment, tightened, and sounded small, like a coin in the palm dot from somewhere above, a thin, muffled footstep, or the settling of something with its own weight and patience. She heard a sound that could have been a laugh or the settling of boxes. She forced her gaze ahead to the window and did not let it drift up, keeping the paper folded small and secret in The instruction felt less like ink and more like a belief, a small ritual handed to a single person, and the apartment answered with a stillness so complete she could hear the ticking of her radiator as if through water. She let the paper sit, folded twice, in the bowl of her palm, the edges cold and slightly damp, with a breath that wasn't hers. She had, she told herself, been alone for months, a string of places and faces that blurred into one work schedule, a calendar full of penciled shifts, and no one to cross out their names. There were keys on the counter, a mug in the sink, a city that kept moving beyond the thin pane, nothing particularly ominous, only the ordinary neglect of life carried in small ways. Still, something in the paper felt like a hinge swinging shut. She sat with it for a long time, timed by the electric heartbeat of the fridge and the thin, steady tick of an old clock in the hallway. The folded square was suddenly very intimate, the crease like a mouth, the paper's corners like knuckles. She knew, as if through muscle memory, how to open it again, pinch, unfold, reveal. But the typed command sat like a palm over the opening. Her pulse climbed. She told herself it was the novelty, the animal reaction you get when a small unknown presents itself in your ordered life. She laughed, a short sound, and then she heard it again from above, the soft, precise reconfiguration of weight. It wasn't a step so much as a rearrangement, the kind that suggests a body changing position slowly and carefully, like a person turning to watch another from the ceiling. Fear is strange. It rearranges small facts into warnings. She had always thought of herself as practical. She stocked her fridge with sensible food, and she paid her bills on time, and she could usually laugh at herself. Tonight, practicality felt like a distant country. She thought about calling someone, anyone, but the idea of speaking across a line felt too loud, too public, like releasing the small private thing that the paper had given her. Instead, she let the paper remain folded and went to the kitchen to make tea. The kettle's whistle, a fragile gauge of time. The apartment hummed with the ordinary noises of night. Pipes clinked. A distant siren rolled. A neighbor coughed somewhere far down the corridor. She brewed the tea and sat at the small table, the folded square midway between her and the sour ring of a mug. Steam fogged the window briefly, then cleared, and in the glass, the faint figure above the apartment held its head very still. She told herself not to look at it, and so she looked toward the table, watching the way the light laid across the fold. Her hands trembled minutely. The folded square seemed warmer than the air. She told a joke to herself, and then felt foolish for doing so. The tea cooled. She didn't drink it. Time in apartments flows. Oddly, minutes can be as long as hours when the brain says nothing else to keep you busy. She had folded things before: notes, napkins, money left in exchange for favors, but never like this. The instruction on the paper was minimal and precise, like an order from an unseen office. She wondered who might have typed it. The thought of a neighbor, a prank, someone with a slow and tidy cruelty amused, and sickened her in equal measure. But the paper bore no fingerprints that she could see, no smudges, no oil, only that faint watermark and the exactness of type. She began to imagine the person who'd left it: patient hands, a methodical gait, the kind of person who would know the exact angle to slip a paper under a door without disturbing a chain. She placed the folded paper on the table between mug and phone and stared at it until the room turned into a slow camera pan, everything slightly out of focus except for that small square. Then, because she was both cautious and bored, and because curiosity is a long, soft animal, she opened the paper. Inside, there was nothing written but the crease lines and a small, almost imperceptible smudge of graphite, like the tip of a pencil had brushed it and smudged, as if to erase something that had never been meant to be legible. Her eyes tracked that smudge as if it were a compass. She folded it twice again, not because the paper instructed her, but because movement felt like an answer on. The second fold, the lights dipped, not a blackout, but a soft sinking, and a pressure settled in the room. A palpable weight, like someone pressed against the thin membrane of the ceiling. When she, despite the instruction, glanced up, that reflex that feels like a betrayal, the mirrored window offered a glimpse of something leaning where no one should be. A pale outline that traced her spine with an accuracy that made her skin prickle. If this has you on edge, subscribe. It mimicked her pose perfectly. Fingers tucked at its sides, head cocked by a degree that was wrong, as if someone had studied her and recorded the small angles. The stranger's eyes were flat, patient slits that refused to blink. When she blinked, they remained open, and the delay between her own lids and the reflections was a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity. She dropped the paper. It fell into her mug with a faint, wet sound. Her heart accelerated in a rhythm she did not recognize, a drum that seemed to fill the small room with an answering pulse. The figure leaned forward a fraction, its mouth shaping words that, when she listened too closely, seemed to be nothing. A movement of the jaw without air. She told herself again to keep her eyes down, to obey that typed line that now felt like a thin, thread-like rope between her and whatever the glass wanted. The ceiling above her, which was just a cheap white slab with a single recessed bulb, suddenly felt like skin. She could imagine the scrape of a fingernail under plaster, the whisper of movement on the other side. She closed her eyes tightly for a moment, tasted copper again, felt how the world narrowed to the two beats of her heart, and the muffled breathing somewhere above a sound like tiny laundry. No, a small patter, like someone raking their fingers across paper, brushed the ceiling. Her phone vibrated on the table. She did not look. The vibration stopped, and then the stillness of the room settled around her like a thing with elbows. She needed to breathe, but did so slowly, counting to 5, feeling the numbers peel the panic a little at a time. When she opened her eyes, the reflection had shifted, the head tilted the other way, as if watching from a different vantage. She realized with a cold, precise certainty that the thing in the glass was not merely a mirror dot. It held characteristics of her. Yes, the slope of a shoulder, the thin scar on her left knuckle. But there were wrongnesses stitched between the true things, jaws too still, a smile that began in the corners of the eyes and never reached the lips. Her phone buzzed again. Brittle and insistent, she forced herself not to move. The sound from above changed. It was now a slow, deliberate drag, as if someone or something was testing seams. She could taste metal with each inhale. The air had gone thin in a way that made her fingers ache. She thought of standing up and going to the window, of lifting the blind and confronting the thing. But the typed instruction felt nuclear in her palm. Twice folded, twice obeyed, twice withheld. There is a particular terror to obeying a rule whose origins you cannot trace. To look up would be to open a contract. To keep looking down was to sign away some small parcel of the world. She had, for reasons she could not name, never been able to ignore instructions once given. Perhaps it was training from years of jobs where orders were simple and consequences immediate. She sat frozen, listening to the apartment and to the small breathing above, and allowed herself one thought. If she kept her eyes down and obeyed, what then? The answer did not come immediately. Instead, the ceiling stirred, as though something had rolled over. A careful rotation, full of thought. She realized with a burning clarity that the thing above was not confined to the glass. It lived in the light, in the air, in the small drag of the night. When she finally, impossibly, heard footsteps above that were precisely her own soft rubber heels, the same irregular cadence. Her entire body folded toward the center of the room, as if trying to shrink beneath a table. She didn't look up. The footsteps paused directly above her, and for a long exhalation, nothing happened. Then she heard a soft, almost affectionate tapping on the ceiling in a rhythm that could have been waiting. She understood, with the small animal clarity of someone facing a predator, that the tapping was an invitation. She kept her eyes down. The tapping paused. The ceiling sighed again. A faint, patient smile creased the face in the glass days. Later, she would notice the small squares folded twice, tucked into places that felt intimate in their wrongness. Under couch cushions, inside the sugar jar, slipped beneath the rim of her shoe. Each paper was folded the same way, corners exact, edges sealed by whatever humidity lived inside the building. She would find one in the fridge between two yogurt containers, and another tucked into a book she had been reading. She would find one in her coat pocket that she did not remember placing there. They were never opened by anyone else. Sometimes she would hear, impossibly, her own footsteps from above. Two soft steps, a pause, a drag, and a laugh that sounded like her laugh, but with the wrong ending. She avoided looking up for days. And then, when the small habit became a thing to be noticed, she began to count the times she obeyed. 103 times she kept her head down, while the ceiling rearranged itself. 4 to 7 times she thought she heard phrases without meaning 11 times, she felt. As she fell asleep, a cold weight pressed down to match her shoulders. At night, the ceiling's shadow sometimes desynchronized with the light. A second's delay that fractured sleep into an animal fear. She would wake and listen and count heartbeats by the rhythm of the overhead steps. Once she thought to pin one of the folded squares to the wall with tape to see if the thing above would respond. But the paper fell to the floor when she left the room, and in the morning it was tucked into the toe of her shoe. She stopped leaving the lights on at night. She slept with a small lamp and a book for company, the bulb a small eye in the dark. The city outside became a dim, indifferent heart that she woke to without surprise. She began to dream odd things: ceilings made of skin, staircases of mirrors, the sound of fingernails reading the alphabet across plaster. When she woke from those dreams, she would count the corners of the room as if they were stitches. Months blurred in this narrow orbit of obedience bills were paid. Shifts were worked. Groceries bought, each small act performed with the same careful avoidance of looking up. Sometimes visitors asked if she was well. She would nod and smile in a way that belonged to someone who kept secrets in tidy foldings. No one suspected the ceiling. Not really, who would, when the evidence lived only in the sensation of pressure and the occasional folded square. She tried once to photograph the window, to catch the pale outline in a frame. But every picture she took was a blur, except for the reflected smile, which always, like a traitor, remained crisp. The smile was patient and slow, and taught it suggested that the thing in the glass was not hurried at all. The small folded squares multiplied. She found them in the grocery bag, in the pocket of a coat she hadn't worn in weeks, tucked under the lip of a plate in the cabinet. Each one was addressed to no one. A private epistle written in folding rather than ink she took to sleeping with the lights dim and the covers pulled up to her chin. And sometimes, in the blue hours, she would swear she could feel fingers tracing the outline of the bulb on the other side of the ceiling. Once she left a small radio on low and tuned to a static station, thinking noise might keep the thing at bay. But the static shaped itself into syllables that sounded like her name. She stopped sleeping without the lamp. She stopped drinking more than a cup of tea at night. She stopped answering the front door late. The small rituals became the scaffolding of her days. And then, one evening, it changed. She was making dinner, something uncomplicated, when she heard the footsteps above that matched the precise rhythm of her own in the kitchen. She felt the hair at the back of her neck rise. She set the spoon down and listened as the steps approached the ceiling directly above her head. For a moment, she considered going out the fire escape, getting into the night, and letting the city swallow her. But the thought of leaving her small, well-contained life felt like stepping into a stranger's palm. She stayed. The footsteps halted above her, and then, with the care of someone testing a jar lid, a slow knock tapped through the ceiling. It was a single, patient knock, 3 beats with a pause between the second and third, she realized, with a clarity that felt like being uncovered, that if she did not look up now, she might spend the rest of her life in small obedience, folded inward and watched. She looked up. The reflection smiled down, patient and not hers. Please like and subscribe, and tell me what time you listened.